Silence fell like a hammer, the kind of silence that makes every breath feel loud, every movement feel amplified. The courtroom was already tense that morning, packed wall to wall with reporters, attorneys, and spectators, waiting for a legal battle that promised sparks. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, confident, composed, and known for her commanding presence. The case itself had drawn national attention. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the buzz outside the courthouse was relentless. Satellite trucks lined the street. Commentators whispered into microphones. Social media was already alive with predictions about how the hearing would unfold. Legal analysts speculated, critics debated, and supporters waited anxiously. Everyone knew this hearing would be intense, but no one expected the moment that would soon unfold. Inside, the atmosphere felt almost electric. The wooden benches were filled to capacity. A low murmur floated through the room as attorneys shuffled papers and adjusted their notes. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only background noise, and even that seemed too loud in the heavy stillness. Every person present understood that this was not just another routine court appearance. The outcome of this hearing could shape reputations, influence public opinion, and possibly set the tone for future legal battles. Bondi sat upright at the counsel table, reviewing her notes one final time. She didn't appear nervous. If anything, she looked focused, laser-focused. Her years of courtroom experience showed in the way she carried herself. Shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, eyes scanning the room with calm awareness. When her name was called, she rose smoothly. Her heels echoed softly against the polished floor as she stepped forward. She adjusted the microphone slightly, glanced briefly at the judge, and then began. Her voice was steady, clear, and deliberate. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Each word seemed carefully chosen, as if placed exactly where it needed to be. She outlined her argument with confidence, weaving facts and reasoning together in a way that demanded attention. There was no dramatic flair, just precision. As she spoke, you could see heads nodding in the gallery. Some scribbled notes, others leaned forward, elbows on knees, hanging on every sentence. Even opposing counsel listened carefully, their expressions measured but alert. Bondi emphasized key points with subtle shifts in tone. When addressing what she believed were inconsistencies in the opposing argument, her voice sharpened slightly, not aggressive, but firm. She was making it clear, she wasn't here to play defense. She was here to challenge. The judge remained still, hands folded, watching her intently. There was something about his gaze, calm, observant, unreadable. He wasn't interrupting. He wasn't reacting visibly, but he was absorbing every word, every pause, every inflection. Bondi continued, citing procedural concerns and highlighting what she described as critical misinterpretations. She moved through her points methodically, building her case like a careful architect laying brick upon brick. Then, for a brief second, something shifted. Opposing counsel began to prepare for their response, shuffling papers and exchanging a quiet whisper. The tension subtly increased. It was the kind of tension that doesn't explode immediately, but simmers just beneath the surface. Bondi concluded a key portion of her argument and stepped slightly back, though she remained standing. The judge nodded, signaling the next phase of the proceedings. As opposing counsel rose to speak, the room's energy tightened. This was where rebuttals would begin. This was where statements would be tested. Bondi's eyes narrowed slightly as she listened to the opening words from the other side. At first, her expression remained neutral, but then, just barely, you could see it, a flicker of disagreement. A statement was made, a claim presented as fact. Bondi's posture stiffened. She gripped the edge of the table lightly, her gaze fixed forward. The words hung in the air, echoing in the quiet courtroom. To some, they may have sounded routine, but to her, they struck at the core of the argument she had just built. The audience sensed it too. There are moments in a courtroom when everyone feels something building. It's almost instinctive. A collective awareness that the next few seconds will matter. Bondi inhaled slowly, as if weighing her options. Interrupt now? Wait for her turn? Let it pass? Or challenge it immediately? Across the room, the judge's eyes shifted from opposing counsel back to Bondi, as if anticipating movement. The air felt heavier. Reporters in the gallery tightened their grip on their pens. One spectator stopped mid-note. Another leaned closer, sensing that something unscripted might be about to happen. Bondi slightly adjusted her stance, the calm exterior still intact, but beneath it, determination was unmistakable. She had built her career on conviction, on refusing to allow what she believed to be inaccuracies to go unchallenged. And in that moment, standing in a courtroom filled with expectation, one thing was certain. Whatever happened next would not simply be another exchange of legal arguments. It would shift the atmosphere entirely. The judge continued to observe quietly, the embodiment of restraint and authority. Bondi's eyes remained locked forward. The opposing counsel continued speaking, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, that the tension had reached its peak. The courtroom held its breath, because everyone knew the edge had been reached. As opposing counsel began presenting a key argument, Pam Bondi suddenly interjected. Her voice cut cleanly through the air, sharp and unmistakable, challenging a statement she believed was inaccurate. It wasn't a whisper tossed politely into the proceedings. It wasn't a routine, almost rehearsed objection spoken in a measured tone. It was direct, and it was forceful. Your Honor, that is not an accurate representation. She didn't even finish the sentence before the entire energy of the room shifted. A few heads turned instantly toward her. Pens that had been racing across notepads froze mid-sentence. One reporter slowly lifted their eyes from a laptop screen. The low shuffle of papers stopped. Even the faint hum of the air conditioner seemed louder in the sudden stillness. The tension thickened like fog rolling in. Interrupting in court is always risky. Courtrooms operate on structure. There's a rhythm. One side speaks, the other listens, and then comes the response. Breaking that rhythm can feel like breaking an unwritten code. It draws attention. It demands reaction. But Bondi was no stranger to high-pressure legal environments. Years in public office and countless courtroom appearances had shaped her into a sharp, confident advocate. She had built a reputation on being assertive, prepared, and unafraid to confront opposing arguments head-on. And in that moment, she clearly believed silence would cost more than interruption. Opposing counsel had just framed a key detail in a way that, from her perspective, distorted the facts. It wasn't a minor wording issue. It struck at the foundation of her argument. If left unchallenged, even temporarily, it could influence how the judge and anyone listening understood the case. So, she acted. She spoke quickly, her words overlapping slightly with opposing counsel's final phrase. She described the statement as a mischaracterization of facts, emphasizing that the record did not support what had just been said. Her tone wasn't disrespectful. There was no shouting, no sarcasm, but there was urgency, real urgency, the kind that comes from someone who believes a line has just been crossed. For a split second, it seemed like she might regain control of the narrative. Opposing counsel paused, clearly caught off guard. There was a brief, almost awkward silence as both attorneys stood facing the bench. The moment hung suspended in midair. Spectators leaned forward. This was no longer just a routine exchange of arguments. This was unscripted, unfiltered, real. Bondi continued, attempting to clarify her points before the statement could settle into the official record. She referenced earlier filings, gestured lightly toward her documents, and began to explain why the characterization was, in her words, incomplete and misleading. You could sense her calculation. She wasn't interrupting for drama. She was interrupting for impact. But courtrooms are not debates on television. They're governed by hierarchy, and at the top of that hierarchy sits the judge. Across the bench, the judge had remained still during the first seconds of the interruption. His expression didn't change. His posture didn't shift. But his eyes narrowed ever so slightly as he observed the exchange. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward. It wasn't a dramatic movement. No gavel slammed. No raised voice echoed through the chamber. But the physical shift alone was enough to signal that the line of control had been reached. The room felt it instantly. Bondi, still mid-explanation, caught the movement from the corner of her eye. Her words slowed for half a beat, but she pressed on, determined to finish her clarification. Opposing counsel stood silent now, hands resting lightly on the table, waiting. Reporters held their breath. Even the spectators in the back rows seemed frozen. There is something powerful about a judge leaning forward in a silent courtroom. It doesn't require theatrics. It doesn't require volume. It communicates authority without saying a single word. And in that suspended moment, everyone understood what was coming next. Bondi concluded her sentence, her voice steady but firm. The final word echoed faintly in the chamber before fading into complete stillness. No one moved. The judge's hands came together on the bench. His gaze shifted directly to Bondi, not angrily, not emotionally, but with unmistakable focus. The interruption had lasted only seconds, but those seconds had changed the atmosphere entirely. What had begun as a structured legal proceeding had transformed into a subtle test of boundaries, of procedure, patience, and power. Bondi stood upright, composed, meeting the judge's gaze. She wasn't backing down, but she wasn't escalating either. She had made her point. Now the response belonged to the bench. The air felt heavier than before. In court, timing is everything, and in that moment, timing belonged to the judge. He leaned forward just a fraction more, and when he began to speak, the entire courtroom listened. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the gavel. He didn't show visible anger. Instead, he spoke with calm authority, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably firm. Ms. Bondi, you will have your opportunity to respond, but this court will proceed in order. The words were simple, measured, almost quiet, and yet they landed with the force of a command. The room froze. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. There was no hostility in his tone, no sarcasm, no trace of personal frustration. He wasn't trying to embarrass her. He wasn't trying to win a verbal battle. He was doing something far more powerful. He was reestablishing control. In a courtroom, authority doesn't come from volume. It comes from position, from responsibility, and from the expectation that procedure will be respected above all else. The judge understood that every person in that room was watching, not just the lawyers, not just the reporters, but the public beyond those walls. And in that moment, he made it clear that the structure of the court would not bend to urgency. Bondi stood still. For a brief second, it looked as if she might push again. Her lips parted slightly, and she began to respond. Your Honor, I simply... But before she could complete the thought, the judge continued. His voice was still calm, but there was a sharper edge now. Not anger, not impatience, just firmness. You may not interrupt opposing counsel during argument. That is not how this court operates. The words echoed across the wood-paneled walls. That is not how this court operates. It wasn't a rebuke of her intelligence. It wasn't a dismissal of her argument. It was a reminder of the system itself, a system built on order, on sequence, on respect for process. The message was clear. The rules mattered more than emotion. Procedure mattered more than passion. And just like that, the entire courtroom shifted. The energy that had been crackling moments earlier suddenly settled into something heavier and more disciplined. Reporters resumed writing, but more carefully now. Spectators leaned back slightly, the anticipation replaced by quiet reflection. Even opposing counsel straightened, sensing that the boundaries had been drawn unmistakably. Bondi paused. Her expression didn't show defeat. It didn't show anger either. If anything, it showed calculation. She understood the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't about who was right or wrong in that instant. It was about maintaining the integrity of the proceedings. Slowly, she nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Her voice had changed, not weaker, but measured, controlled. She gathered her papers, adjusted them neatly on the table, and sat down. That small action, sitting down without further protest, spoke volumes. It demonstrated something many people overlook in high-pressure moments: professionalism under correction. The judge gave a slight nod in return and gestured for opposing counsel to continue. And just like that, the rhythm of the courtroom resumed. But it wasn't the same rhythm as before. Something had crystallized in the air, an understanding. A reminder that no matter how high-profile the case, no matter how experienced the attorneys, the courtroom itself operates under a structure that does not bend easily. The judge leaned back into his chair, hands folded once more. His expression returned to neutral, almost serene. The moment had passed, but its impact lingered. Opposing counsel resumed speaking, this time more cautiously. Words were chosen with greater care. There was no triumph in their tone, only focus. When it was eventually Bondi's turn to respond again, she rose with the same composure she had displayed earlier. But now there was a subtle shift. She waited for the exact cue from the bench before speaking. Her voice was steady, precise, and strategically paced. And interestingly, her argument seemed even stronger this time. Because now, every word was delivered within the structure the judge had reinforced. There was no overlap, no interruption, just clear, organized advocacy. The spectators noticed it. The reporters noticed it. The judge certainly noticed it. What could have escalated into tension or conflict had instead transformed into a quiet lesson in courtroom dynamics. Authority does not need to shout. Leadership does not require humiliation. And correction, when delivered with composure, can command more respect than anger ever could. That single exchange, brief, controlled, and disciplined, had reset the tone of the entire hearing. The courtroom no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like what it was meant to be, a place where arguments are heard in order, weighed carefully, and decided within the boundaries of established rules. And in that stillness, one truth stood out clearly. The strongest voice in the room isn't always the loudest. It's the one that reminds everyone how the room is meant to function. For a brief moment, Pam Bondi stood completely still. The shift in energy was almost physical. What had felt sharp and electric seconds earlier now felt measured, contained. The air in the courtroom seemed steadier, as if the tension that had stretched it thin had been pulled back into alignment.
She didn't argue further. She didn't sigh in frustration. She didn't show visible irritation. She nodded once. It was a small gesture, but in a courtroom, small gestures carry weight. Then she calmly gathered her notes, adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, and took her seat without further protest. That silence? It wasn't awkward. It was powerful. There's a difference between silence born of defeat and silence born of discipline. This was the latter. No one in the room mistook it for weakness. If anything, it amplified the seriousness of the moment. The judge had reestablished order, not with force, not with anger, but with composure. He didn't need to raise his voice or assert dominance through intimidation. His authority rested in something steadier: procedure, structure, and the understanding that the courtroom operates by rules that apply to everyone equally. And in doing so, he reminded everyone in that room, lawyers, spectators, members of the media, that the courtroom is governed by structure, not spectacle. In movies and television, legal battles are often portrayed as dramatic showdowns. Attorneys pace dramatically. Objections are shouted. Judges bang gavels repeatedly. The tension builds toward explosive confrontations. But real courtrooms are different. Real power in a courtroom often comes from discipline, from patience, from knowing when to speak and when to wait. As opposing counsel resumed their argument, the tone was noticeably more cautious. Words were chosen carefully. Phrases were deliberate. The earlier interruption had sharpened everyone's awareness. The margins for error felt thinner now. Bondi listened without interruption this time. She didn't interrupt again. She didn't visibly react to statements she disagreed with. Instead, she wrote notes, quick, precise lines on a yellow legal pad. Occasionally, she underlined a phrase. Occasionally, she circled a word. It was clear she was preparing. And preparation in that moment became more powerful than protest. The spectators in the gallery seemed to sense the transformation. What had started as a near confrontation was now unfolding into something more disciplined. Reporters who had briefly anticipated headlines about courtroom drama now found themselves documenting something subtler, but perhaps more meaningful: professional restraint. When her turn finally came again, the judge gave a slight nod. Bondi rose. This time, there was no urgency in her movement, no sharp edge in her tone. She waited until the courtroom was fully quiet before speaking. Your Honor, if I may respond to the point raised earlier. The difference was immediate.
Because she had waited, because she had allowed the process to unfold, her words carried more weight. They weren't competing with anyone else's voice. They weren't layered over another argument. They stood alone. She addressed the exact statement she had previously challenged, but now she did it within the court's rhythm. She cited the record. She referenced specific filings. She calmly explained why the characterization was, in her view, inaccurate. There was no rush. And because there was no rush, her reasoning felt sharper, stronger, more deliberate. Even those who may have disagreed with her position couldn't deny the effectiveness of her delivery. By aligning herself with the structure of the court rather than pushing against it, she strengthened her credibility. The judge listened attentively, occasionally glancing down at documents, occasionally looking directly at her as she spoke. There was no tension now, only focus. What could have turned into a shouting match became something else entirely, a lesson. A lesson in professionalism under pressure. High-stakes environments test more than knowledge. They test composure. They test judgment. They test the ability to adapt in real time. Bondi had been corrected publicly, in a room full of observers, in the middle of a critical hearing. And instead of escalating, she recalibrated. That recalibration shifted the outcome of the moment. Because when she finished her response, the courtroom didn't feel chaotic. It felt ordered, structured, intentional. The exchange had revealed something deeper than disagreement. It had revealed the balance that makes the legal system function. Attorneys advocate passionately. Judges maintain order. Both roles are essential, but without discipline, even the strongest argument can lose its force. As the hearing continued, the earlier interruption became just a memory, a brief spike in tension that ultimately reinforced the importance of process. And for everyone watching, inside that room and beyond, the message was clear. Strength isn't just about speaking up. Sometimes it's about knowing when to sit down, take a breath, and let your argument speak at the right time. In that courtroom, on that day, professionalism won the moment. Not through volume, not through confrontation, but through composure. When the hearing finally came to an end, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and the quiet discipline inside gave way to a rush of conversation in the courthouse halls. Reporters moved quickly, comparing notes. Legal analysts spoke in hushed but animated tones. Supporters and critics formed small circles, each offering their own interpretation of what had just happened. Some observers believed Pam Bondi had been absolutely right to challenge the statement the moment she heard it. In high-level legal battles, timing can shape perception. If a claim is left unanswered, even briefly, it can settle into the narrative. To them, her interruption wasn't impulsive, it was strategic. Others, however, felt the judge handled the situation exactly as he should have. Courtrooms, they argued, cannot function on impulse. They rely on structure, on patience, on a shared understanding that every side will have its turn. Different opinions filled the hallway, but nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The judge's response had silenced the entire courtroom in a way that few moments ever do. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive. There was no shouting match, no heated back and forth spiraling out of control. It was controlled, and sometimes that's far more powerful. In high-stakes environments, whether in court, in business, in politics, or even in everyday disagreements, interruptions can feel necessary. When something sounds wrong, when emotions rise, when reputations or outcomes are on the line, the instinct is immediate. Jump in, correct it, take control. That instinct is human. But what unfolded in that courtroom revealed something deeper about authority and leadership. Authority isn't about volume, leadership isn't about who speaks first, and strength isn't about overpowering someone else. It's about maintaining order when tension rises. It's about standing firm without losing composure. It's about commanding respect not through intimidation, but through steadiness. The judge didn't compete for control of the room. He simply exercised it, calmly, precisely, without theatrics. And that calm precision had a ripple effect. Because once order was restored, everything else flowed more clearly. Arguments were heard without overlap. Points were addressed in sequence. The focus returned to substance rather than spectacle. For viewers who later followed the story through news reports and commentary, the exchange stood out, not as a scandal, not as a clash of personalities, but as a reminder of how institutions are supposed to function when they work as intended. Courtrooms are not arenas for dominance. They are systems built on procedure. And procedure exists for a reason, to ensure fairness, clarity, and balance. Bondi, for her part, remained a formidable legal presence throughout the remainder of the hearing. The interruption did not define her. The correction did not diminish her. When given her proper turn, she argued with clarity and confidence, reinforcing why she has long been regarded as a strong advocate. The judge, meanwhile, remained the steady hand guiding the proceedings. His demeanor did not shift after the moment passed. He did not revisit it. He did not escalate it. He simply continued forward, focused on the case at hand. And the case itself continued, shaped not by emotion, but by arguments presented within the structure of the court. But that single exchange, brief as it was, became the highlight. Not because it was loud, not because it was controversial, but because it revealed something fundamental about power. In that silence, everyone in the room felt it. The power of discipline, the weight of authority, the impact of measured words. There's something unforgettable about a room full of people going completely still, not because they're shocked by chaos, but because they recognize control. The moment lingered long after the hearing ended. It became a talking point, a lesson, even a symbol of how quickly a tense situation can be redirected with composure instead of confrontation. And maybe that's why it resonated so strongly. We live in a time where volume often dominates conversation, where the loudest voice can seem like the strongest one, where interruptions are common and patience is rare. But that courtroom told a different story. It showed that the strongest statement isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it's the quiet correction, the steady reminder, the calm assertion that structure matters. Because when tension rises and emotions threaten to take over, the true test of leadership isn't who can speak over the noise. It's who can restore order without adding to it. And on that day, in that courtroom, order was restored not with force, but with calm resolve. That is what people remembered. That is what echoed beyond the courthouse walls. And that is why the moment mattered. If you enjoyed this courtroom story and want more real-life moments of tension, power, and unforgettable responses, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next story.